This lesson we talk about the mole, and we're not talking about the type of mole that you would study in biology that's cute and burrows, which you see a picture of it here. We're talking about a unit in chemistry. And so before we start talking about a mole, let's talk about familiar units. And one in particular is a dozen. And so, your parents tell you to go to the store, get a dozen eggs. You know instantly that you are going to get 12 eggs because 1 dozen equals 12 eggs. And so you can buy multiple dozens, you can buy fractions of dozens. And so we're just going to go from eggs to dozens and dozens to eggs just for two examples. And then we'll connect it to the mole a little bit later because you're going to be doing the same math. All right. So in 10 dozen, how many eggs are there in 10 dozen? And so you know instinctively that you can just go, okay, so there's 10 dozen and there's 12 eggs per dozen. And so I know that 10 times 12, and it should be 120 eggs. We know instinctively to do this because we're so familiar with a dozen. And so mathematically, how you set that up is you're going to create a bridge. You're going to put the given in the top left. And in this case, it's 10 dozen. And so every problem is going to have a given. And so you just take the number that you're given in the question, you put that down in the top left. And where did I get that? I got that right there. 10 dozen, put that in the given top left. You can put it over 1. And then you have to think to yourself, how many eggs are in 1 dozen? And we already addressed this issue, so 1 dozen equals 12 eggs. Now you get to decide. You can either put the orange 1 dozen down below on the top or on the bottom right, or you can put the pink 12 eggs on the bottom right. And to answer your question is you need to put the same unit as your given because your given's on top. You want to put the same unit on the bottom because you want them to cancel eventually. So you're going to put the orange 1 dozen on the bottom. That way they will cancel because dozen divided by dozen is 1. So it's effectively multiplying by 1 and you end up the same number. So they cancel. All right. So then 1 dozen on the bottom and you need to put the equivalent on top, which 1 dozen equals 12 eggs as you see. And then check your units, make sure they cancel. We want those to cancel. That's good. And so then 10 times 12 is 120, and then you retain eggs as your unit. Next question is, what if there were 40 eggs? How many dozen is that? And so you arrive at the answer the same way mathematically. You set up your bridge. You put your given, which is 40 eggs is your given. You put it over 1. And you know that 1 dozen equals 12 eggs. And then you have to decide what goes on the bottom. 1 dozen, which is orange, or pink, 12 eggs. And so you look at what unit your given is in. Your given is an egg, so you want the 12 eggs that's pink on the bottom. And then you put the equivalent, which is on top, 1 dozen. And then eggs cancels with eggs. Always do this step. Don't skip that step because that tells you if you set it up correctly. And then you take 40 times 1, which is 40. And then 1 times 12, which is 12. And so you can simplify it with 40 dozen divided by 12. Again, eggs drops off the map because they cancel out. And then in your calculator, you take 40 divided by 12, and it'll tell you how many dozen. And you should have gotten 3.3 dozen. Okay, let's switch to talking to the mole. So a mole is just a unit that the chemists use. And so it's based on how many atoms of carbon there are in a 12-gram sample of carbon-12. So if I had 12 grams of carbon-12, there would be 6.022 times 10 to the 23 particles. And so particles is a generic term. It could either be atoms, it could be molecules, but particles is just generic. So 1 mole equals 6.023 particles. In your mathematics, if you want to abbreviate the mole, there's only one abbreviation that's appropriate, and that's MOL. Any other abbreviation would be inappropriate. Little m means meter, for example, in science. When you see little m, that always means meter. If you see big M, that means molarity, which is something that we'll talk about, a concept we'll talk about later. All right, let's apply this to 2 examples. And so how many atoms of silver are there in 2.2 moles of silver? And so just like when you were solving for the dozen, you build a bridge. You put your given on the top left, which is 2.2 moles. And so where did I get that from? It's boxed in red up there in the question. You have to be given a starting point. That's your starting point. You put it over 1. And then you have to think to yourself, how many particles, or in this case, we're specifically talking about atoms, how many atoms are in 1 mole? And that was on the previous slide. So 1 mole equals 6.022 times 10 to the 23 atoms. And then you have to think of what goes on the bottom right. And the answer to that question, it matters what your given is in. So you want the same unit your given is in. So the orange 1 mole would go on the bottom because you want the mole to cancel. And you put what's equivalent to orange is pink, 6.23 atoms. The moles cancel. And then you put 2.2 times 6.022. You'll end up with a number. And then you write that number down and then keep the 10 to the 23 because that gives you the magnitude. And you can further simplify this if you so choose. You could divide 13.2 by 10. You could take out a 10 there and then add it to your stack of 10s to no longer have 23 to have 24. So 13.2 divided by 10 is 1.32. But you end up with one more 10, so it's 24 instead of 23. And so 1.32 times 10 to the 24 atoms. Okay, last example. So this time you're given the number of atoms, which is 1.81 times 10 to the 23 atoms. And it's asked you how many moles. So again, you start your bridge. You put your given in the top left. You put it over 1. And then you need to think about the relationship between 1 mole and the number of atoms. And yes, 1 mole equals 6.022 times 10 to the 23 atoms. And then you got to think about what goes downstairs on the right. And you want your units to cancel. And the only option you have is the pink option. So you put the pink option down there, 6.022 times 10 to the 23 atoms. That way your atoms will cancel. And then you put the equivalent on top. And then you check your work, cancel your atoms. And then this 10 to the 23 divided by 10 to the 23 is 1, right? So those cancel. And then you simply just need to put 1.81 in your calculator divided by 6.022. And that'll give you the number of moles. And the number of moles should be 0.301.